So, back in May of 2026, the newly appointed administrator of NASA is sitting down at this highly publicized US Senate Committee on Appropriations hearing. And I mean, normally this is a really dry exercise,
Right,
right?
incredibly dry.
You go to a Senate budget hearing to talk about, line item logistics. You're talking about rocket fuel costs, launch schedules for the coming year. It's not usually headline news.
Right, discounting. It's basically space accounting.
Exactly. But instead, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman decides to use this super formal congressional setting to pick a very public fight. And not just a minor disagreement, he's picking a fight with the entire astronomical community over a 20-year-old grudge.
Yeah, he really went for it.
He did. His mission. He wants to make Pluto a planet again.
It was a remarkably aggressive maneuver for that specific venue. I mean, he was sitting there fielding these very standard logistical questions from Senator Jerry Moran,
Yeah.
and he just completely pivoted, just totally changed the subject. Yeah. He didn't just make like an off-the-cuff remark to a reporter in a hallway. He explicitly stated on the congressional record that his team is actively preparing documents to relaunch the Pluto debate within the broader scientific community.
Which is wild. He was bringing actual paperwork to a fight that, honestly, most people thought ended 2 decades ago. And, well, that is exactly what we are diving into today. Welcome to this custom deep dive, specially curated just for you.
Yeah.
Because, wow, you handed us a wildly eclectic stack of sources today.
You really did. It's a fascinating mix.
Right. So, on one hand, we have this detailed May 22, 2026 report by a journalist named Adrian covering that exact Senate hearing and Isaacman's whole planetary crusade. And then on the other hand, you gave us this super vibrant visual advertisement for a brand new Excello chocolate wafer called Bono Duo.
Which I know on the surface, orbital politics and a crunchy chocolate bar seem entirely unrelated, like completely disconnected.
Don't go.
But the mission for this deep dive is to explore the profound tension between strict bureaucratic definitions and the incredibly messy, complex reality of the universe.
Yeah.
We are basically looking at how human beings they struggle to categorize things that simply refuse to fit into neat little boxes.
Okay, let's unpack this, because by the end of our time today, you are going to understand the mechanics of why an icy world, literally billions of miles away, is causing a bureaucratic civil war, and crucially, what that celestial body has in common with a violently crunchy chocolate bar. So let's start with the motivation behind Isaacman's Senate declaration.
Right, the why of it all.
Yeah, like why is a billionaire, entrepreneur, and private astronaut who just took over NASA in December 2025 so obsessed with Pluto?
Well, a large part of this is it's a legacy crusade. Isaacman feels very strongly about giving Clyde Tombaugh, he's the American astronomer who originally discovered Pluto way back in 1930, the recognition that Isaacman feels he still deserves.
Because that was a huge deal back then, right?
Oh, absolutely. Tombaugh's discovery was a massive point of American pride in the 20th century. So by demoting Pluto, a lot of people felt Tombaugh's legacy was unfairly diminished. And Isaac Lemon is, he's actively trying to correct what he views as a historical slight.
Looking at this, it really feels like it's a new CEO taking over a beloved century-old heritage company.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Right, and immediately upon taking charge, they just decide to reinstate a discontinued fan-favorite product, completely ignoring the current board of directors, just to honor the original founder of the company. It's like this aggressive branding move to rally public sentiment.
I mean, that CEO analogy works to a point, but it misses one really crucial detail. Isaacman doesn't actually own the company that makes the rules here.
Right. NASA doesn't actually get to decide.
Exactly. NASA doesn't define what a planet is.
Yeah.
So he is looking at this beloved asset that was, in his view, wrongfully demoted. But to understand the massive wall he is running into, we have to travel back 20 years to the highly controversial rulebook written in 2006.
Right. The day Pluto was officially stripped of its planetary status, when the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, basically held a massive vote and just rewrote the laws of the solar system.
He did. And, from a bureaucratic standpoint, the IAU felt their hand was completely forced by new discoveries at the time. To manage the chaos, they established 3 very strict criteria for a celestial body to be officially considered a planet.
Okay, let's go through these.
So the first rule is pretty straightforward. The body must orbit the sun.
Which Pluto does. I mean, it has this weird, highly elliptical orbit that actually crosses Neptune's path sometimes, but it goes around the sun. So rule one is a pass.
Yep, rule 1 is a pass. Rule number 2 gets a bit more mechanical. The body must have sufficient mass for its own gravity to overcome rigid body forces so that it assumes a nearly round or spherical shape. This is a state known as hydrostatic equilibrium.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that for a second, because I think people take spherical planets for granted.
They really do. They just assume things in space are round.
Exactly. But when you have a smaller rock, like, say, an asteroid, it's usually shaped like a lumpy potato.
Right.
And that's because the molecular bonds of the rock itself, its structural strength, are actually stronger than its own microscopic gravitational pull. So it holds its lumpy shape. But once a body gathers enough mass, its gravity becomes so intense that it literally crushes its own structural integrity.
It just pulls everything in.
Yeah, it pulls all of its material uniformly toward the center of mass, smoothing itself out into a sphere. And Pluto has enough mass to do that. It is definitively spherical.
That's a really great breakdown of the physics. And you are right, Pluto easily passes rule number 2. It is entirely in hydrostatic equilibrium. But rule number 3.
Here we go.
Rule number 3 is where the entire system breaks down for Pluto. The IAU stated that a true planet must have cleared the neighborhood around its orbit of other debris.
And boom! That's the rule that gets Pluto kicked out of the club because it shares its orbital zone with all the other icy objects out in the Kuiper Belt. But, okay, wait a minute. Let me push back on this because I'm looking at this third rule, and I have to ask, doesn't Earth share its orbital space with massive amounts of near-Earth asteroids? And doesn't Jupiter literally have the Trojan asteroids caught right in its orbital path? If they are sharing space with thousands of rocks, doesn't that make the IAU's third rule completely inconsistent?
What's fascinating here is that exact inconsistency is the core of the opposing argument.
Really? So Isaacman's camp is using that?
Absolutely. The opponents of the 2006 definition point to that very flaw. Now, the IAU dynamicists, the orbit people, they argue that clearing the neighborhood is about gravitational dominance.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
The argument is that Earth and Jupiter fundamentally dictate the gravitational dynamics of the remaining debris. Like, they are the bosses of their orbits. If a rock is there, it's there because Jupiter allows it to be there. Pluto, on the other hand, is gravitationally dominated by Neptune, and it's just one of many similar-sized objects kind of swimming around in its neighborhood.
But it still highlights how arbitrary the line is. I mean, the rule isn't based on a measurable intrinsic property of the object itself, like its geology or its shape. It is entirely based on where it happens to live and the local real estate dynamics.
Yeah, and that shows how the IAU's attempt to neatly categorize the solar system with this rigid three-point checklist ultimately ignores the messy, nuanced reality of space. Because, I mean, the universe doesn't care about our bureaucratic checklists. It just exists.
It really doesn't.
And the IAU only created this checklist because they realized the neighborhood Pluto lives in was vastly more complex than anyone originally saw it in 1930.
Which brings us to the messiest neighborhood of all, the Kuiper Belt. Because this is the whole reason the IAU got into this definitional panic in the first place, right? So sitting out there past Neptune, anywhere from 30 to 50 astronomical units away in the deep freeze of space, what is actually happening out there?
It's chaos. The discovery of the Kuiper Belt in the 1990s was a total watershed moment. It completely transformed our understanding of the outer solar system. Because for decades, astronomers thought Pluto was just this lonely anomaly out in the dark.
Just a weird little rock on its own.
Exactly. But as telescope technology improved, they realized Pluto wasn't an anomaly at all. It was actually the gateway to a completely new, vastly populated zone.
It is incredibly crowded out there.
Enormously crowded. It is a massive frozen reservoir of worlds. Current estimates suggest there are over 100,000 objects in the Kuiper Belt that are larger than 100 kilometers in diameter.
Wow. Over 100,000.
Yeah, and hidden among all that ice and debris are other massive spherical bodies. Things like Eris, Haumea, and Makemake. And these are considered vestiges, like the leftover building blocks from the very formation of the solar system, just perfectly preserved in the cold.
So the IAU sees all these new bodies being discovered in the 90s and early 2000s, especially Eris, which is essentially the same size as Pluto, and they panic.
They totally panic.
They realize that if they stick to the old definition, they don't just have 9 planets anymore. They have 10, then 12, then maybe 50 planets. And the textbooks would have to be rewritten every single year. So, to contain the clutter, they invent a new label. They create the term dwarf planet.
Right. They created a new bureaucratic box just to keep the original box of planet feeling exclusive, tidy, and manageable for the public. They essentially walled off the Kuiper Belt.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because in July of 2015, NASA's New Horizons probe finally arrived at Pluto. It's been nearly a decade flying through space just to get there. And before 2015, Pluto was just a blurry, pixelated smudge in our best telescopes.
Barely even a few pixels across.
Exactly. But New Horizons executed this incredibly close flyby, and the data it sent back completely shattered the assumption that Pluto was just some dead, boring rock of ice floating in the dark.
Oh, the imagery was breathtaking. But scientifically, the data was a complete revelation. It completely upended our models of planetary geology in the outer solar system.
They found a violently active world. I mean, it has towering mountains made of solid water ice. Because it is so cold out there, like nearly 400 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, water ice becomes as hard as granite. It literally forms the bedrock of the planet.
Which is just wild to think about, water acting like rock.
Right. And flowing across that bedrock are vast glaciers made of frozen nitrogen. Because nitrogen stays pliable at lower temperatures, you have these active flowing glaciers constantly resurfacing the planet. Plus, there is evidence pointing to a massive liquid water ocean buried deep beneath the icy crust, kept warm by a radioactive core.
Yeah, the internal heat was a huge surprise.
And it has a hazy blue atmosphere. It has distinct weather patterns by every visual and geological metric. It is doing planet stuff.
It is doing planet stuff. It is an incredibly dynamic environment. And the New Horizons flyby perfectly highlights the ongoing fundamental tension between orbital mechanics and planetary geology.
Wait, so if orbital mechanics only cares about the neighborhood and geology only cares about the body itself, aren't astronomers and geologists essentially speaking two completely different languages at this point?
That is precisely the root of the conflict. The dynamicists, the astronomers who care about orbits and gravity, which is what the IAU really focused on in 2006, they look at Pluto and say it is just a dwarf because it hasn't cleared its path. They care about the map of the solar system.
The routing, basically.
Right. But the geologists look at the incredible terrain, the nitrogen glaciers, the atmosphere, and they say, look at what this body is. They care about the terrain itself. But despite those spectacular geological findings in 2015, the IAU dynamicists held their ground and refused to change their definition.
They completely dug their heels in. And that brings us right back to Jared Isaacman in 2026, sitting in that Senate hearing, declaring that NASA is bringing the fight back to the IAU. But this exposes the limits of NASA's actual authority, right? Because they can't just decree a scientific fact.
Exactly. And this highlights a really fascinating bureaucratic reality. NASA, despite its massive budget, its incredible technological reach, and its cultural influence, they cannot simply issue an executive order stating that Pluto is a planet.
They don't have the badge for that.
They don't. The power to define celestial classifications rests solely with the IAU, which is an international non-governmental organization of professional astronomers. NASA can only, as Isaacman said, escalate the topic.
So they are essentially acting as a highly motivated, well-funded lobbying group within the scientific community. Like, they have to gather white papers, host symposiums, and just try to persuade the global consensus.
And this intense lobbying effort, it really points to a much deeper theme present in your sources today. Because this entire debate over Pluto, the Kuiper Belt, and rigid body forces is fundamentally a struggle over language and cognition.
Language? How so?
Well, it is about how the limits of our established vocabulary inevitably fail to capture complex new realities. When human beings encounter something that just doesn't fit into our existing words, we experience cognitive friction.
Oh, which brings us to the absolute brilliance of the second source you gave us. Because when standard vocabulary fails to describe a messy reality, this friction isn't just an astronomy problem. We see this exact same instinct to fabricate language in everyday culture. If we don't have a word for it, we just invent one.
Exactly. We synthesize entirely new labels to manage our experiences and regain a sense of conceptual control.
Okay, let's look closely at the visual source you provided. It is an advertisement for a chocolate wafer bar. The brand is Exelo, and the product is called Bono Duo. The ad boldly features the Arabic word ye, which translates to new, signaling right away that this is a break from the past.
It's setting a new baseline.
Right, and the image is incredibly visceral. You have these thick wafer bars violently snapping in half, crumbs flying everywhere, layers of cream and chocolate stretching and breaking. It is a total sensory overload. And boldly, right in the center of this chaos, it asks the viewer, do you speak T9 Armish?
It is a striking visual. And it's just a fascinating piece of linguistic marketing. Because analytically, the cognitive mechanism at play in this candy bar ad is doing the exact same thing the IAU did in 2006.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. How exactly does the cognitive framing of a chocolate bar mirror the International Astronomical Union?
Well, think about the sensory experience of biting into a highly layered, crispy, chocolatey wafer. It is a dynamic, complex event, right?
Absolutely.
Your brain is trying to process the sudden snap of the wafer, the resistance of the chocolate, the crunch of the layers collapsing all simultaneously. Standard language has broad umbrella words like crunchy, crispy, or snappy.
Right, the usual suspects.
But crunchy is an inadequate box here. It doesn't fully encompass the specific hypersensory reality that the X-Cola brand wants you to experience. So they couldn't use a standard word. They fabricated a linguistic concept, T9 Armish.
It looks and sounds almost like a code or like an onomatopoeia. By blending the letter T, the number 9, and the rest of the word, it feels hyper-specific. It's meant to evoke the exact sound, feel, and intensity of that specific crunch.
Yes, it is a linguistic anchor. T9 Armish is a fabricated label meant to define a complex sensory reality that standard language simply couldn't handle. Now, map that exact cognitive mechanism onto the Kuiper belt.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the astronomers in the 90s are staring at a sensory overload of icy debris, trying to process Iris and Haumea, and standard language, the word planet, is an inadequate box.
Precisely. In the 1990s, astronomers discovered this massive, messy region of space filled with dynamic, icy bodies. The old vocabulary failed. The umbrella term planet couldn't handle the newly discovered clutter without completely losing its meaning.
It would just be too broad.
Right. So what did the IAU do? They fabricated a linguistic concept to regain control over the taxonomy. They invented the term dwarf planet.
They invented T9 Armish for space. They just slapped a brand new label on a complex reality so they could neatly categorize it and move on.
Exactly. Both the Exela wafer ad and the IAU classification represent the deep human instinct to invent new labels to manage things that simply do not fit into our pre-existing neat little boxes. Whether it's the ultimate layered crunch of a new wafer or the chaotic, icy clutter of the outer solar system, when reality gets too messy, we create a new category to give ourselves the illusion of order.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive? We have covered some fascinating ground today. We started with Jared Isaacman, a billionaire NASA administrator turning a routine Senate budget hearing into a bureaucratic insurgency against the established astronomical community.
A very unexpected turn of events.
Truly. And we explored the astonishing mechanics of the Kuiper Belt, where Pluto defies its dwarf label by showcasing towering ice mountains and flowing nitrogen glaciers. And finally, we looked at how an advertisement for a violently crunchy chocolate wafer leverages the exact same cognitive tricks as the world's top astrophysicists.
Because it all comes down to the labels we use and how those labels fundamentally shape our perception of reality. The borders we draw, whether they are orbital zones in the solar system or fabricated words in our vocabulary, they are ultimately just human inventions designed to make us feel comfortable.
And as we've seen, when reality updates, sometimes those inventions need to be aggressively challenged.
Which leaves us with an important question for you to consider. Because this isn't just an academic debate about definitions, right? Labels dictate action.
They really do.
If rigid labels like planet versus dwarf planet dictate which space missions get federal funding, which probes get public attention, and which discoveries end up in school textbooks, are our strict scientific vocabularies actually blinding us from exploring the most fascinating, geologically active worlds in our universe?
That is a great point.
Right. If we simply dismiss a vibrant, complex world because it was placed in the dwarf box, what incredible wonders are we systematically choosing to ignore?
Because at the end of the day, the universe doesn't care what we call it, but what we call it completely changes how we choose to see it. Thank you so much for providing such a uniquely challenging, thought-provoking stack of sources today. Keep questioning the labels, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.